Welcome back. We're back in the cold and the breath today. This one gets wild because it starts with breathing and ends with your immune system. And somehow psychiatry, democracy, and cold water all get dragged into it. The big claim is simple. You can train your body to handle stress better. Which sounds insane until the experiments start looking annoyingly real. That is the annoying part, right? He keeps saying the breath is the key because it changes your chemistry. Like you breathe a certain way, CO2 drops, and your body starts shifting. Which is a very dramatic way to say, stop breathing like a panicked pigeon. A panicked pigeon is exactly the visual I did not need. But his point is that shallow breathing keeps you stuck in reflex mode. And when you go deeper, you supposedly start accessing stuff that got buried. That's the part people in breathwork circles always describe as trauma surfacing. The question is whether it's trauma or just your nervous system freaking out. Maybe both, honestly. He leans hard on the idea that stored stress is biochemical, not just emotional. So if you change the pattern, you change what the body can release. That is a much bigger claim than just feeling relaxed after breathing. It is also a much better pitch than sit here and think positive thoughts. True, because nobody wants to buy a positive thought subscription. What really hit me was how much he framed modern life as emotional numbness. He basically says society trains us to stay obedient, stressed, and insensitive. That is where he starts sounding like a prophet and a provocateur at the same time. Yeah, he's not just teaching breath, he's accusing the whole system. And he ties it to everything from consumerism to war to people losing empathy. That is a heavy lift for a breathing method. Still, the emotional argument is strong because stress does make people shut down. You see it in work, in family, and how people stop noticing anything beyond survival. And then he says the cold is one way back into feeling, which is such an evil sentence if you hate cold showers. Bro, the cold is not my spiritual home. But the Patrice example is perfect because it shows the trauma angle really clearly. If cold water was punishment as a kid, of course your body associates it with danger. Then later, with training, the same stimulus becomes something you can control. That is a beautiful revenge arc for the nervous system. The body was like, oh, we are not helpless anymore. And that is what he keeps hammering on, right? Mastery over your state. Not avoiding stress, but meeting it with a trained response. The anti-fragile version of health, basically. Exactly. And the studies are what make the whole thing dangerous in a good way. The Michigan study, the cold suit, the scans, the heat production, all of it. He is literally showing that people can influence responses that were assumed to be automatic. That's the insane part. Your body was apparently reading a different instruction manual the whole time. Maybe we all were and nobody told us. Then the E. coli study gets even crazier because that is not just temperature, that is immune response. Inject a toxin and most people get flu-like symptoms, but he didn't respond normally. And then the trained group showed they could shift the response too. That is the real headline, not the cold plunge videos. Because the flashy part is the ice bath, but the actual thesis is nervous system control. Exactly, the cold is just the doorway. He even says that if you do not go to the cold will come to you. That line sounds like a very intense motivational poster. But it lands because life does hand you stress anyway. So his answer is to train on purpose before life trains you by force. And that is where he starts talking about disease, stress, and immunity as connected. I do think people hear that and immediately want a magic cure. But that is not what he is saying, at least not fully. He is saying stress weakens the system, and training may widen the buffer. That feels way more defensible than cold water solves everything. Yeah, because otherwise we'd all just become ice cubes and call it wellness. The wellness industry would love that marketing, though. What I found interesting is how much he distrusts medicine as the only answer. He keeps saying pills can manage symptoms but not always solve the root. That part always gets messy because people need medicine too. Totally, and the strongest version of his point is complement, not replacement. Still, I get why he frustrates institutions because he makes control feel accessible. No expensive machine, no complicated ritual, just breath and discomfort. Which is rude, frankly, because it makes the solution look cheap. Cheap and annoying is the worst combo for a serious system. The 3 pillars part is useful because it grounds the chaos. Breath, cold exposure, and commitment to mental focus. It's almost boring when you strip it down like that. which usually means the hard part is actually doing it. He is also obsessed with safety, which people ignore when they copy viral clips. He keeps saying, do it controlled, do it seated, do it where you will not lose control. That matters because the method is supposed to increase agency, not create danger. Imagine fainting into the middle of your self-improvement routine. That would be the least enlightened thing possible. What did you think about the breathing instructions themselves? They sound simple, but there is a lot happening underneath the simplicity. Inhale fully, exhale without forcing, repeat, then hold after the exhale. And then he treats that pause like a switch into another gear. He thinks the no-breath state is where the body starts reorganizing stress, or where people just feel weird and start assigning it meaning. Fair but weird plus meaning is basically half of human transformation. The interesting thing is, the subjective report matches the lab's pretty often. People say they feel clear, peaceful, focused, or like they woke up. That post-session stillness sounds almost addictive. And then he brings in the Australia study to compare it with mindfulness. He is basically saying this outperforms the classic calm-down tools. I would want to know exactly how they measured that, but it is still compelling. Because if true, that changes how we think about regulation entirely. Also, the guy clearly loves saying compelling evidence like he is building a case. He is absolutely prosecuting the old model. And maybe that intensity comes from his own story. He keeps circling back to loss, trauma, and finding a mission. It makes the method feel less like a fitness hack and more like a life response. That is why people connect with it beyond the science. Though the science is doing a lot of heavy lifting for the merch, too. Obviously, the ice cube aesthetic is undefeated. Still, I do buy the central idea that comfort can make us brittle. Not because comfort is evil, but because adaptation disappears without challenge. And once adaptation disappears, every little stress feels huge. That is probably the most honest takeaway from the whole episode. So basically, breathe better, suffer a little on purpose, and become harder to break. Very normal lifestyle advice, nothing to see here. Completely casual, just a tiny ice-based identity shift. All right, we will leave you there for now. In the next one, we get into how far this idea of control really goes. And things get even more personal, weird, and honestly a little unbelievable. Welcome back. This one gets into cold, breath, and control. And honestly, it turns into a full argument with the body itself. What I keep circling back to is the claim that stress is trainable. Not just mentally, but chemically, physically, all of it. Which is a wild thing to say with that much confidence. It is wildly confident, but the science stories are not small. The central idea is that breathing can change blood chemistry fast. And that shift then changes what the brain and body do next. That is where people usually go, wait, is this real or performance? Because it sounds like someone bragging after 3 cold showers. But the weird part is the mechanism is actually pretty coherent. You overbreathe, CO2 drops, dizziness kicks in, and the body reacts. Then the method is basically using that state on purpose. That is the part that feels almost too simple. Simple is his favorite word, which is always suspicious. But simplicity is part of the appeal because it is repeatable. Sit down, breathe, hold, recover, and the body starts responding differently. Still, simple does not automatically mean universal. That is fair, but the studies make the case harder to dismiss. The cold water experiments are the flashpoint because they are so visual. People love a visible human doing something impossible in a lab. We are basically primates with a documentary habit. Exactly, and he knows that, which is why the story lands. In that first Michigan study, the standout thing was control. Same cold stimulus, different reaction because breathing changed the response. But that does raise the annoying question of how much is technique, how much is person. Exactly, and that is why the follow-up matters more than the legend. When other people were trained, they also showed changed immune responses. That is the point where the story stops being about one extraordinary guy. It becomes about whether humans can learn voluntary control over stress systems, which is a much more annoying sentence for the old assumptions. Extremely annoying, because it pokes at the whole automatic body myth, and the immune system angle makes it even bigger. If stress affects immunity, and you can modulate stress, the loop matters. That is still not the same as saying cold showers cure everything. Thank you, because somebody always tries to sprint there immediately. The better claim is narrower and stronger. stress response is not fully fixed. And if that is true, then emotional regulation starts looking biological, not fluffy. That is actually the most interesting part to me. Because people hear trauma and think only memory, but he means stored chemistry. Something unresolved in the body, not just a story in the head. That framing is powerful, but also easy to oversell. Totally, and yet it matches what people report in breathwork sessions. They come out talking about old pain they did not expect to touch. Not because the breath told them a memory, but because it shifted access. That distinction matters a lot. Otherwise, every weird inhale becomes a spiritual autobiography. And the internet would absolutely ruin it within a week. What I found compelling is the anti-fragility argument underneath all of this. We avoid discomfort so aggressively that normal stress starts wrecking us. He is basically saying the body gets soft when challenge disappears. Soft is one word, but I get the point. Then the cold becomes a controlled dose of adversity. Not punishment, not macho nonsense, but training. Which is funny because he grew up with cold as punishment. That detail is huge because it flips fear into agency. Same stimulus, different meaning, different body response. That is almost too neat, but life does love symmetry sometimes. And it explains why the emotional side is never separate here. Cold is not just temperature, it is a relationship with discomfort. Breathing is not just oxygen, it is a steering wheel for state. I do wonder how much of the benefit is ritual, though. Ritual matters, but the lab results suggest it is not only ritual. The intercostal muscle heat, the adrenaline, the pain modulation, all of that. So the ribs are basically doing side quests now. That is exactly the kind of sentence that makes physiology sound fun. And maybe that is part of why this spreads so fast. It gives people a felt sense of power in a life that feels outsourced. That political edge kept showing up too. The idea that obedient, dulled people are easier to manage. He pushes that pretty hard, maybe harder than the data alone needs. True, but the cultural critique is consistent with the method. If you never face hard things voluntarily, hard things own you. That line hits because modern comfort can become a trap. And he keeps arguing that the body was built for challenge, not avoidance. Which is why he keeps pushing the word control, not cure. Control over response, over fear, over panic, over the spiral. Not control over everything, just enough to stop collapsing. That is a much more believable promise. And honestly, maybe that is why people trust it. It does not sound like escape, it sounds like training. All right, we will leave you there for now. In the next one, things get even more personal and a little stranger. We get into how far this idea of control really goes. Welcome back, because this episode gets into cold, breath, and control. And also why people keep thinking this is impossible until they try it. I mean, the wild part is how quickly this stops sounding like wellness fluff. It turns into like a direct argument with your own nervous system. That is the whole obsession here, not just cold water as a stunt. The claim is basically that breathing can change chemistry fast enough to matter. Which sounds insane until you hear the body being described like machinery. Like blow off enough carbon dioxide and the whole trigger system shifts. Which is a very aggressive way of saying, you have not been breathing well. Yes, exactly, your lungs have been doing the minimum wage version of their job. And the argument is that modern life keeps us shallow, numb, and disconnected. He keeps coming back to this idea that people avoid deep emotion like it is poison. But he is saying the avoided thing is also the doorway. That is where people get nervous because it sounds mystical. Right? But then he keeps dragging it back into biology and physiology. He is basically saying trauma is stored chemistry, not just a memory story. And that is a much more annoying idea because it means you cannot just think your way out. Which is rude, honestly, because thinking is our favorite hobby. The whole pitch is that breath interrupts the old pattern before the body spirals. And that is why people at breath sessions suddenly start talking about childhood stuff. Not because the room is magical, but because the system finally loosens. He keeps using the word control, but not in a cold robot way. More like, can you stop the body from hijacking the mind every time stress hits? That is a very different promise from becoming superhuman. Although he absolutely talks like a man who thinks superhuman is available on request. He really does, and somehow it is weirdly charming. But the science he points to is why people keep listening. The cold exposure studies, the breathing studies, the immune response stuff. The big idea is that the autonomic system is not fully automatic, which is a huge claim because that is literally where all the fear lives. He is saying you can train the response before it becomes collapse. And that is where the cold becomes a test, not a punishment. Except most people experience it as a personal attack from nature. Which, fair because cold water is extremely disrespectful. The Patrice example is actually perfect for that point. Because his resistance was not about physics, it was about old punishment memory. That is such a human thing to mistake trauma for identity. And then the method becomes a way to separate the two. Not by talking about it forever, but by changing the state. Which is exactly why therapists and science people both get interested. Because this is not just a mindset trick, it is a state change. And the interesting part is how much of it is built on very simple steps. Breathe deeply, let the exhale go, hold after exhale, then recover. That is the entire gospel, and somehow it sounds illegal. It does sound like a biohack cult instruction manual. But the important part is safety, because he keeps warning against doing it in risky places. No water, no driving, no random ego trip situations. Basically, do not try to become enlightened on a freeway. And once you strip away the hype, the philosophy is actually pretty hard to dismiss. He thinks comfort has made us weak, not because comfort is evil, but because it removes friction. And if you never meet discomfort, you never build the machinery to handle it. That is the part that lands because it is not just about ice baths. It is about jobs, stress, grief, conflict, all of it. He basically says the body needs training for life, not just comfort. Still, you can see why people push back on the science claims. The numbers are dramatic, the language is dramatic, everything is dramatic. He has never met an understatement he wanted to keep. But the best version of this is not the bragging. It is the possibility that people are far less fragile than they think. And honestly, that is what makes it contagious. Because if one person can calm a panic response, maybe that is not a fluke. Maybe it is a trainable human capacity we just never used. Which is a little embarrassing for civilization if true. And that is where the bigger argument sits, not just health, but human potential. If stress is everywhere, then control over response becomes almost political. Because a resilient person is harder to manage through fear. That is the most interesting edge of the conversation, honestly. Not because of conspiracy, but because dependence grows when people feel weak. And he is saying we have normalized weakness so completely that we call it modern life. Which is a savage thing to say to a room full of wellness consumers. Especially while half of them are paying for heated blankets and anxiety apps. Still, the core message is simple enough to survive the spectacle. Can you train your body to meet stress without immediately falling apart? If yes, then everything from sickness to mood to fear changes shape. That is why the cold matters, because it makes the invisible visible. You feel the boundary, then you learn it is movable. And that is the entire addiction of this idea. Once people feel that, they want the next level immediately. Which, to be fair, is exactly how this method spreads. All right, we are going to leave it there for a second. In the next episode, it gets even stranger and much more personal. We go deeper into where this whole obsession with resilience really came from. Welcome back. This one is all about cold, breath, and control. And somehow it turns into stress, trauma, immunity, and the whole modern misery machine. Which is a lot for one ice bath, honestly. But that is the wild part. He is not selling cold water. He is selling the idea that your body is not as helpless as you think. And that is where people either lean in or roll their eyes. Because the moment he says breathing can shift chemistry, everyone wakes up. That part is not woo-woo if the data is even halfway real. The breathing piece is so simple that it almost feels annoying. Right, like you are telling me I spent years overcomplicating oxygen. But he keeps coming back to CO2, stress, and the body's trigger systems. That detail changes everything because the breath is not just relaxation. It becomes a lever into the nervous system. And then he pushes it further into trauma that was just sitting there. That is the unsettling part because people do not think of trauma as chemistry. They think of it as memory, but he keeps saying it is stored in the body. So when the breath changes the state, the memory starts talking. Or people finally stop drowning it out, which is maybe less mystical and more human. That is a very unglamorous way to explain a spiritual breakthrough, but probably the more honest one. What I cannot ignore is how much he links comfort with weakness. He really thinks modern life is making people softer in the worst way. Not softer emotionally, but less capable of feeling and responding. That line about insensitivity in society hits harder than the science stuff sometimes. Because he is not just talking about cold plunges, he is talking about numbness. And then he drags that numbness into politics, war, and daily obedience. That is the part where he becomes way bigger than a wellness guy. He is basically saying your spreadsheet job is one long spiritual emergency. That is brutal, but not totally unfair. And his argument is that people who can feel deeply are harder to control, which is why he keeps talking about taking back the steering wheel. Not from a motivational poster place, but from a biological one. That is what made those studies so explosive. The breathing, the cold, and then suddenly the immune response is changing. And the insane part is he keeps saying other people can learn it too. Which is where the ego gets annoying because now everyone wants to be special. True, nobody wants to hear that the superpower is reproducible. But that reproducibility is exactly why the science matters. If 18 trained people respond differently, that is not just one frozen Dutch guy. That is a system other people can access. And that is where the cold gets weirdly emotional. Because it is never really about temperature, is it? It is about whether you can stay present when your body screams at you. That is the whole game right there. Cold water is just the most dramatic teacher imaginable. And breathing is the quiet part that lets you stay in the class. I also think the trauma angle makes people less dismissive. Because once he talks about his own grief and turning pain into practice, it stops feeling theoretical. It becomes survival dressed up as method. That is heavy, but it is also why people trust it. He is not saying be harder for the sake of it. He is saying become present enough to not be dragged around by every stress signal. Which in this world already sounds like a miracle. All right, let's breathe for a second and let that land. Because the next layer gets even more personal. Episode 3 is where the origin story really starts to bite.